Welcome to Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark. We're in 1 Timothy chapter 2. We're continuing our thoughts here in verse 4 this lesson. But before we begin, Jeremiah 15:16, Thy words were found, and I did eat them. And thy word was unto me the joy and the rejoicing of my heart. Now, as we saw the end of last lesson, in the first part of verse 4, he says, who will have all men to be saved. And we know that it is God's will, it's his desire that all men be saved. God is not declaring it or decreeing it to be so, but God's desire is that all men be saved. And people are free volitional beings, and they have to make that choice. But God's heart is that all men be saved and spend eternity with him in heaven forevermore. So he says, who will have all men to be saved and come unto the knowledge of the truth. And the Greek word here for knowledge is epignosis. And the prefix epi means upon, and gnosis means to know or to gain knowledge of something. So the prefix epi strengthens this word to mean, it means to have full or exact knowledge of something or someone. It's not just knowing something, I know about something or but it means to go beyond knowing something and to study it exactly. All right? It means to have sharp discernment. So, this Greek word carries with it the idea that the person doing the knowing is actively involved in getting to know this thing or this person. So, it's not just epignosis, just doesn't mean, well, you tell me about somebody, somebody at work. Oh, this is Joe, and they live in a certain city, and he has a wife and he has kids, and that's nice, right? Well, I know Joe now because you told me about him, and you told me his wife's name and the children's name. But other than that, I don't know anything. That's surface knowledge. But epignosis means that I get acquainted with Joe and his family, and I get to know him much more deeply. And that's what epignosis means. It means to not just to know something, but to take time to study and to be actively involved in knowing that thing. This Greek word is also seen in Paul's letters in Ephesians chapter 4, and in verse 13, where it says, till we all come into the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God. The what? The epignosis of the Son of God, unto a perfect man, unto the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. So we are to be actively involved in growing in our knowledge of Jesus Christ. Day by day, we are to be actively involved in knowing him. And it's not just, I'll just let the pastor tell me Sunday mornings and that's enough. And if you go to Bible study on a Wednesday or Thursday night, I'll let him tell me too a little bit. But no, it means you yourself are actively involved in knowing him. All right? And then in Colossians chapter 1 and in verse 6, it says, which is come unto you as it is in all the world, and bringeth forth fruit as it does also in you, since the day ye heard of it. And know here is epignosis, the grace of God in truth. So we are to know, in Colossians 1:6, we are to be actively involved in growing in our knowledge of God's grace. So we're to be actively involved in knowing Jesus Christ and God, and actively involved in knowing the grace of God. And then in 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 7, 2 Timothy 3:7 says, ever learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. They are ever learning, but they're not able to come to that knowledge of the truth. The men and the women of the last days, which 2 Timothy chapter 3 is referring to, it's the people of the last days. They will always be learning, but the end result is they will never come to a place where they have a deep, full knowledge of the gospel and of God's truth. It says here in verses 1 and 2, this know also that in the last days perilous times shall come, for men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful. These are last days people. And verse 7 says they will ever be learning, they will ever be knowing, but they will not come to the knowledge of the truth. All right? They won't have a full, deep knowledge of who Jesus Christ is, and of the cross, and of the blood, and of salvation. So God wants everyone not to just have a surface passing knowledge of the gospel or of the truth, but to have a hunger and a desire to want to know Him and to be saved and be loved by the one who created them. And that's the key. God created us. He wants us to know Him and to grow in our knowledge of Jesus Christ and of who He is. And most people, the people of the last day, people today, they just have a surface knowledge of God and they're happy with it. They only know about God with what somebody at work tells them, or somebody at church. You know, they go to church once a week or whatever, or once every few months, and that's the extent of their knowledge of God. And yet Paul here is trying to tell us we are to have an epignosis of God, a full, exact knowledge, and the only way to do that is to be actively involved in our pursuit of knowing Him, in knowing His grace, knowing truth. So he says in verse 4, who will have all men to be saved and to come unto the knowledge of the truth. Knowledge of the truth. The end result of all of man's pursuit of knowledge should finish in knowing God's truth as it's revealed in Jesus Christ. So there's many religious people out there, professors and teachers and religious people out there who have a knowledge of God and of the Bible, but they don't know the truth. They don't have an epignosis of the truth. Colossians chapter 1, verses 16 and 17 says, for by Him were all things created. By who? By Jesus Christ. It's to know Him, know Jesus Christ. For by Him were all things created that are in heaven and that are in the earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones, dominions, principalities, powers, all things were created, what? By Him and for Him. So now listen, verse 17 says, and He is before all things, and by Him all things consist. He's before. Even an honest and thorough study of the world or of the universe should lead us to the knowledge of Jesus Christ. And this is sad when scientists and people study the world, they study the universe, and it doesn't lead them to Christ. It doesn't lead them because they don't know Christ. And they reject Christ in their heart, and they purposely want to pursue a knowledge that is outside of God, outside of a responsibility, outside of an accountability to God and to Jesus Christ. They don't want to be accountable to God. They don't want to admit that the Bible is true. They don't want to be accountable, their lives to be accountable to a holy God. And therefore, that as the basis causes them to want to pursue a knowledge of the world and of the universe outside of God, and it leads them into destruction. All right? But if we're true and honest with this universe and with the earth and with God's creation, all knowledge should lead to why? Because all things were created by Him and for Him. And if we're true and honest in our study of the universe and of the things of this world, they will lead to Christ. That knowledge will lead us to Jesus Christ. And when we pursue a knowledge of the universe and of this world outside of Christ, it leads to no end. How can I say? There's an emptiness. There's an emptiness in that knowledge. You never come to the end. Why? Because there is no ending in that knowledge. There is no ending. There is no uniformity in that knowledge. Because the context of this verse is talking about salvation, then the truth that is spoken of here is mainly referring to all truth which leads people to be saved. So, again, the context of verse 4 says, who will have all men to be saved. That's the context of this verse. And to come unto the knowledge of the truth. And the truth should lead us to salvation. It should lead us to Christ, and it should lead us to come to Christ and humble ourselves to the cross and to receive the washing of the blood of Christ upon our hearts. So this is what God is trying to tell us. God wants all men to be saved, but God wants all men to be in hot pursuit of knowledge of Him, of Jesus Christ. Okay? And to know the truth of God, the truth of salvation, the truth of this universe and this world, everything materialistic. In our pursuit of knowledge of anything materialistic should lead us to Christ. Why? Because all things were made by Him and for Him. Principalities, dominions, powers, they were all made by Him and they were made for Him. So any pursuit of knowledge of these things should lead us to Him. All right? And if it doesn't, there's something wrong with us. That's for sure. There's something wrong with us if it doesn't. We're starting from the wrong premise. If our knowledge of this world and the universe, of this materialistic, does not lead to Christ, then our basis, our foundation is wrong. All right? So, this is a tremendous verse that I like this. Epignosis. God wants us to have a full and exact knowledge of Him, to be actively involved in knowing Him. All right? Until next lesson, walk with the Lord. I know He walks with you.